There were buildings on fire, cars on fire. Those pictures like you see of Beirut or Lebanon, anything like that, it looked just like that. And I thought, what am I doing here?
As the adrenaline goes and everything happens, you think you're actually part of it. In fact, you were. You were in a small basement, crowded out with armed officers shouting instructions.
Everything was thrown there. And I don't think at the end anybody knew who was throwing what at who.
The flames coming out the window were licking all round his body. And I could hear his voice saying, "Cut the damn ropes, cut the damn ropes."
Close up and criminal, at the focus of riot and mayhem, in its 100-year history, the Metropolitan Police Photographic Branch has seen it all. Now, pictures never before released from the branch's unique archive tell the inside story of some of Britain's most notorious sieges and riots. These were the scenes from original police recordings of the riots of May Day 2000. The police were unprepared for the intensity of the protest. Outnumbered, their tactics grew more desperate and counterproductive. This year, it's a 5 o'clock May Day morning start for Steve Myler at New Scotland Yard.
I've been a Met photographer for 10 years and doing public order for about 8.5 of those 10. Been involved in most of the major demonstrations that have happened in that time, bar the last May Day. This is my first May Day, I missed the last one.
This is the cricket box, the obligatory cricket box. We don't want the family jewels damaged.
As a photographer and as part of an evidence gathering team, you're very much a target, because obviously you're gathering evidence on individuals that could be used against them at a later date, so you're very, very much a target.
The purpose of the blue woolly overall is it is actually flame retardant, so you can go up like a Roman candle and it won't necessarily, you won't necessarily get burned.
The Met's photographers are civilians. It's the potential violence of riot and the need to be at the very centre of it that makes the protective uniform necessary.
Quite often you would have a pub that would just erupt into violence. You'd have beer glasses hurled at you, bottles, anything really that people can find to throw at you.
The camera we use,
which again is pretty much expendable. And that's me about ready for action. Myself will be deployed with some police officers. My role is to gather visual evidence whilst they gather audio evidence and written evidence, essentially. But I'm there as a support service for them.
The police have learnt their lesson from the violence of the previous year's protest. This time, the Met have decided on a policy of zero tolerance. There was zero tolerance, or at least no way out, for a group of IRA men in 1975, when they fled to a flat in the West End and held the tenants hostage. The Balcombe Street siege was screened from the media. 25 years on, for the first time, in the still pictures taken by police photographers, we can see the drama in close-up.
4 IRA suspects under being pursued took 2 tenants hostage in a flat. The photographic branch was installed in a basement flat opposite. I think that was one of the first sieges of its type that we were involved with.
Peter Skitt was one of the photographers on the rota of the round-the-clock stakeout.
It had already started, the siege, when I got there, and I was part of the team that was relieving other people on camera to carry on a surveillance of the premises. So once you got into the setup, it was a question of looking and photographing anything that happened, anything that was dramatic. The police taking up positions below the balcony, any activity that went on, we photographed it.
As negotiations went on by telephone, the Met's photographers recorded every development from their basement bunker. It was a standoff with total surveillance. No one wanted a shootout. No one wanted to make martyrs of the men who were suspected of the outrages in Guildford and Woolwich.
We did take several photographs throughout the siege, but certainly of people occasionally appearing at windows, and of negotiations continuing, and of food being lowered to the suspects and to the hostages. I was fortunate perhaps to be there on duty when it actually came to an end and they surrendered. Well, it was quite graphic, quite nerve-wracking at the time.
The siege had lasted 6 tense days.
I saw the couple being led out on the balcony whilst I was there. It was quite a dramatic situation.
2 things, it turned out, broke the deadlock, leading to the release of the hostages and the surrender of the IRA gang. The assurance that the SAS would be kept on the leash, and the promise of one last meal before the doors of the prison van clanged shut.
I remember they came out, they were instructed to emerge from this flat onto the balcony at the front of the building, one by one, with their hands in the air, and certainly they were covered by several armed police officers in the street on the floor below and on adjoining balconies. You know, this wasn't television, this was for real, and it really was quite an impact.
Any false move by police or photographers could have led to panic and a shootout. It was a triumph of patience and persistence. After the terrified tenants had been released, one by one the 4 IRA men edged along the balcony at gunpoint, their surrender lit up by the flashes of the Met's photographers. In part 2, Dodging the Bricks, the Met photographers go to Petrol Bomb Alley for a baptism of fire. The May Day anarchists seem appropriately disorganized. Students, cyclists, animal liberationists, 100 different agendas in search of a central rallying point.
It is starting slowly now to pick up. There's a crowd of 1,500 to 2,000 at Euston already. So it is slowly starting to pick up.
It's not just surveillance on the ground. This is the central control room at New Scotland Yard, where, in a civil libertarian's vision of hell, every breath you take, every move you make, the police will be watching you. For the moment, though, the capital is calm, the protest failing to find a focus. Have the demonstrators trapped the police into what will be seen as a provocative overreaction? Steve Myler knows that his presence may be provocative. He'll be seen as part of the apparatus of repression, especially with his 2 uniformed minders.
For the vast bulk of police photography work, you need to have quite a laid-back attitude. This obviously isn't a particularly stressful environment, but later on in the day it may well become quite stressful.
Passion and provocation on both sides turned some 60s peace demos into war zones.
Oh, they were horrendous. I mean, taking photographs was secondary to trying to keep yourself A, upright, and B, out of the way of missiles. Everything was thrown there. And I don't think at the end anybody knew who was throwing what at who.
Grosvenor Square, 1968.
It was pandemonium. There was horses being pelted with ball bearings and darts and all sorts of things. And horses are pretty good in a situation like that, but I saw a couple of them fall over and things. But it was dreadful. What was I thought rather amusing was they had a line of American Marines that looked like their football quarterbacks all lined up, absolutely pristine, absolutely shining, and they never moved a muscle. I mean, they got things thrown at them, but they never actually joined in. I mean, they could have been most useful, but they never were.
Civil disorder presents a real challenge to the police, as in 1936, when police were caught in the middle as thousands of fascists supporting Oswald Mosley confronted anti-fascist demonstrators in central London. The riots led to the introduction of the Public Order Act. In 1976, at Notting Hill, Carnival turned into chaos. (1977), Lewisham, when the police protected the BNP's freedom to cause offence, and riot shields were used for the first time in mainland Britain. Southall in 1979, when frustration and dissent erupted onto the streets. 18 officers were injured. Riots bring the issue of surveillance and civil liberty into stark confrontation.
One that really started it all were the Brixton riots. And there, if those of you can remember, the police confiscated a lot of press pictures, which in fact did cause a lot of upheaval within the newspaper industry. The photographers weren't very happy at all, the press photographers, because they felt that any future event they'd be the targets for any of the bricks that were being thrown. And so the police really started to look at ways that they could obtain imaging of that. And the first thing that they wanted to do was to for us to issue cameras to policemen. And I said no, I felt that this was a wrong way to go about it. I said that you cannot tell or teach somebody within a few courses, which you tended to do with police. They go on a course for something, they learn how to use a radio, they learn how to use something else. It's not the same using a camera. I won that argument. In fact, we used to go to the police training establishment down near Heathrow, where they had a miniature town, it looked like a film set, just shop fronts and house fronts and things like that, no backs to it, but laid out in streets so that they could do mock battles.
This is Riot City.
Right, we're at the Public Order Training Centre, which is a Met Police establishment where essentially police officers are taken through riot scenarios.
The missiles are softer than real ones, but the petrol's real enough.
We'll be doing a little bit of petrol bomb training, which is essentially to familiarise officers with petrol bombs and the experience of going up in a ball of flames. It is possibly more dangerous, but on the other hand, they're throwing wooden blocks here, whereas when you're out in the real world, it's lumps of concrete and they hurt a lot more when they hit you. I haven't actually experienced a petrol bomb out in the real world. I've only experienced them here. So, in the real world, no, I've never had a petrol bomb flung at me in anger. Petrol bomber! It was a pretty good scenario. Again, the instructors quite rightly picked on the evidence gathering team and made sure plenty of petrol bombs and missiles came their way, because that's the way it is in the real world. I'm not so sure what sort of condition my video camera's in. That took a direct hit about halfway through, so we'll see what videotape you've got.
A council estate in southwest London. Here, the violence has been the real thing, a showdown at knife point. One of the photographic branch's 10 women members, Jackie Bishop, has been called out. The flat is a dealing room for local drug suppliers. One of them is now critically wounded, to judge by the trail of bloodstains leading from the room. It's a sensitive case, and the detective doesn't want to be identified.
Gentleman's turned up to buy some crack, gone in, bought some crack, went downstairs. He knows a little bit about what he's buying. He's looked at it and decided it wasn't very good. He's come back upstairs and confronted whoever's in here. and for his troubles he's been stabbed a couple of times in the chest. He's then gone downstairs. There's no blood from here.
There's no trail?
No.
Right, okay.
Until you get outside and where obviously the cordoned off area is.
And that's where he's ended up?
And that's where he's ended up.
Is there anything inside that you need?
No, just a shot of this. That's all I'm after anyway.
Okay. Just follow a route, hopefully, that the victim took, and then follow it back out again. So when they're talking about it in court, all the photographs should be sequential so that it follows one on from the other.
Jackie used to be a fine art photographer. She's never regretted turning to crime, even on a routine and sordid assignment like this one. Women in the branch must be prepared to do anything the men do. They're just as often in the thick of riot. But this time Jackie's glad she's only dealing with the aftermath of violence.
Yes, I wouldn't like to have to see it all, must admit. I don't like things like that. You can pretend it's tomato ketchup when it's just like that.
Civil disorder takes many forms. Football violence plagued the 1980s, as at this Southampton-Everton clash in 1984, where police photography had to distinguish between the troublemakers and the genuine fans. The presence of cameras can itself add to the problems. The hooligans sometimes relish the opportunity the cameras offer to their exhibitionist bravado. Or there's the violence of anger and simmering social disadvantage, which caught fire in 1985 at Broadwater Farm, North London.
That was very bad. I got a call at about 5 o'clock in the morning that a policeman had been killed at Tottenham that night. In other words, it's 5 o'clock in the morning, so prior to that, a policeman had been killed. And would I get down there straight away and see what I could organise from a photographic point of view at the scene of crime? So, of course, I went to Tottenham Police Station, and it was mayhem. The police photographers had been out during the night with the riot shield teams, and a lot of photographs had been taken of suspects, but they wanted the scene covered from top to bottom with video and stills. Would I get cracking? I got in the Mini and went down to the estate, and it was rather peculiar. It was that bizarre feeling that you were in a battlefield, but I was the only one there. There was no one else.
Calm seemed to have returned to the estate. A few hours earlier, the streets had been awash in a blazing tide of fire. Now, the morning light revealed the full extent of the night's chaos.
I was walking around the streets, and there were buildings on fire, cars on fire. Those pictures like you see of Beirut or Lebanon, anything like that, it looked just like that. And I thought, what am I doing here?
What Alan Parker was doing, like every Met photographer, was gathering evidence. The police photographer's job isn't just to record, it's a forensic, evidential function.
Peter Palmer, I think, was the photographer who took the picture of the chappie coming at him with a balaclava and a mask on and an offensive weapon in his hand. And Peter had taken his picture, and he was wearing quite distinctive clothing. The denim jacket was trimmed with a sort of a red gingham pattern. And anyway, when we raided a house, we came across this jacket and the trousers and the clothing. So, of course, the chap was arrested. And what I did, I set the clothing that we'd got from the house out in exactly the same pattern as Peter Palmer's photograph of him advancing towards the cameraman, confidently took it to the Old Bailey, but the jury threw it out. He wasn't guilty.
In the early autumn of 1975, a siege at the Spaghetti House restaurant in Knightsbridge paralysed the West End. Hundreds of police were drafted in. It was a milestone in police siege tactics and in siege photography.
Spaghetti House was, in fact, actually, was not a terrorist incident. It was an ordinary armed robbery that went wrong, and they barricaded themselves in and a siege took place actually in Knightsbridge.
Police cordoned off the restaurant where 9 Italian staff were held hostage in the basement by gangsters calling themselves the Black Liberation Front. Police gunmen took up positions directly outside the basement door. So did the police photographers, whose pictures we can now see for the first time. Long days and nights went by.
You know, you get used to a scene when you're sitting there and not much happens. The hostages are in the room in the basement and the people who are holding them prisoner, you know, you get a rapport. And the police had what they call microphone contact with the terrorists, for want of a better term, and they could hear everything they were saying. And the detective inspector who was in charge of the D11 firearms, he said to me, "Oh, God," he said, "I wish I could see what they were doing behind that door. We can only hear them." So I said, "Well, you can see what they're doing if you want." So he said, "Well, how are you going to do that?" So I said, "Well, I was a medical photographer. I happen to know an endoscope exists. And what it is, it's a small lens on the end of a long, flexible light tube. I said, if you drill holes in the floor to put microphones in, then you can drill holes in the floor to put endoscopes in." So he said, "Where can we get one of these things?" So I said, "Well, there's a medical photographer friend of mine in the hospital round the corner. He's a good place to start." He said, "Well, get round there and get it." So I did. I went round. We got an endoscope piece of kit, which was offered up through the holes in the floor, and we were able to see what they were doing. This image was transmitted to a monitor, in which one of my colleagues was photographing what was going on the monitor, so we were able to see by the second what they were doing. The only unfortunate thing as far as we were concerned is that the chappie who was in charge of the group down there saw these things coming through the ceiling in odd places, and he didn't know quite what they were, but they chewed paper and stuck it over the end of the endoscope, so we lost our view. And every few hours or a day or so, a new hole had to be dug so that the new endoscope could go through, and they were through at the floor level and the ceiling level and behind a pipe and all sorts of funny places. But they did their job.
It's quite extraordinary, because one wonders actually why it was actually needed, all this photography, but somehow these jobs tend to be a sort of catalyst for trying out new equipment and new ideas. One almost needs a job like this to progress forward. And in hindsight, when you look at it, you wonder why you ever did such things. Wasn't probably the safest things to actually try and actually do.
By the end of the 6th day, the mix of surveillance and psychological pressure was wearing the 3 gunmen down. The instant of surrender can be the moment of maximum danger, when the hostage takers have nothing to lose.
It was almost unreal being so close to a drama that was actually happening. As the adrenaline goes and everything happens, you think you're actually part of it. In fact, you were. You were in a small basement, crowded out with armed officers shouting instructions to these people who were coming out. It was incredible immediacy of it, but one assumed that everybody was going to do their part and that the villains were going to play ball, which they did, thankfully.
Police photographers used to enjoy the privilege of a ringside seat at moments of criminal drama, like the release of the dishevelled waiters and their captors. But times have changed. There's a more cautious approach now to the control of delicate negotiations involving hostages.
Nowadays, of course, it would be controlled from a much greater distance. You would never, ever get that close. Even the support services would be well and truly far away in case anything went wrong. But in those days, I'm afraid we were sort of probably slightly naive. It could have easily gone pear-shaped, yes.
May Day, mid-afternoon. The protest is concentrated in a core of activists whose identity Steve Myler has been tasked to capture.
It's intelligence-led, so we're photographing individuals either whilst they're masking up, before they mask up, so that later when they're photographed or videoed, we can actually match faces to clothing and other descriptions. somebody on a megaphone there who's obviously one of the organisers, so again, she's photographed.
In part 3, Alan Parker returns to the Iranian embassy with the inside story of the SAS Siegebusters. It's not all riot and mayhem. A Metropolitan Police photographer gets to visit some nice places with interesting, not to say exotic, company.
I mean, we do accompany the vice squad officers on various raids, and some of the photographs that I've taken are of the premises, including the paraphernalia that they do use. It's quite interesting to see. I have to say that when the officers go in, it's quite friendly. I mean, I've been on such jobs where they've offered officers cups of tea as we've sat around talking while I take the photographs. And it's all quite friendly, you know. It's quite good, actually. Yeah.
The South London suburb of Streatham. In a pleasant tree-lined street at number 32 lived a woman who famously once remarked that sex was just like having a nice cup of tea. Cynthia Payne often blurred the line between sex and catering. She sometimes took luncheon vouchers as payment for sexual services. But the visit from the Met was strictly professional.
It was one of her party nights, and we'd gone round en masse, a couple of coach loads of police officers and 2 photographers. And really it was just a question of gaining entry to the premises, and I believe they'd had 2 undercover police officers working in there at the time anyway. And so we gained access quite easily, and it was a question of really just sort of rushing into the place and rushing everywhere, sort of taking snap, 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 snap as you go along. One or 2 of the rooms that we went into, several of the snaps were sort of quite revealing, really. Various males and females in states of undress and certain state of excitement and such like. So it was quite revealing. There was one room that I burst into with the aid of a police officer, and there was a rather well-endowed, elderly, blonde lady, should I say, in a... I can remember it vividly, actually. It was a purple sort of camisole and undergarment, and a gentleman wearing nothing but a vest and a very big erection. But as soon as the camera went off, that went down quite quickly.
Miss Payne apparently had access to the best legal advice.
To my knowledge, I believe there were several judges and barristers and other type of people which are fairly sort of high profile, which I think the powers to be decided that they should exit by the sort of side door, and there was a mass dispersal of Rolls Royces and BMWs and such likes, and several gentlemen in wheelchairs, I believe, as well, were let go as well. Everybody just appeared to be having a nice party. There were sandwiches, teas and cakes, and gentlemen dressed as waitresses and all sorts of things. As you do, you know, usual SW16 party.
There's little that human beings can do to each other that hasn't been through the lens of veteran police photographer Alan Parker. In 1980, police surrounded the Iranian embassy, where gunmen were holding 26 people hostage. By luck and a fair degree of cunning, Alan Parker was in the front row for the climax of the siege.
The idea was to park a group of photographers in the park opposite, behind a sandbagged embankment, and click pictures of the front of the embassy as and when these people showed their faces. So they sorted out a rota, 3 two-day stints, if you like, and I copped the last one, which was on, I think, Sunday and a Monday. And of course I thought, oh great, you know, sitting in the park behind sandbags on a Sunday, and I think the Monday was a bank holiday, and I thought, oh, just my luck. Anyway, the call came, would a photographer please come to Alpha Control? So I went over and a chap came out the door and he said, are you Special Branch Photographic? And I thought, well, no, I'm not going to lose the opportunity to take some pictures. I said, yes, yeah, we're Special Branch Photographic. He said, good, go with this D11 firearms officer and we want you to photograph everybody that shows their face at the window. This is the Commissioner's direct request. Well, I was up in the Lord Knatchbull's flat up there, which overlooks this rather well. I think it was on the 3rd or the 4th floor. It's a little bit difficult to remember now, but it was up there overlooking this whole scene. And that's where young Flane and the police officers were with their sniper rifles.
Young Flane remembers.
It was quite sort of nerve-wracking, you know, for me. I was probably no more than 100 feet from the actual rear of the embassy. I hadn't been in the job that long, only about 6 months, so I was still quite green. And I never expected, well, I don't think any of us expected how it would end.
The police will always try to negotiate an end to a siege. But after 5 days, it was clear that a peaceful resolution was no longer possible.
I've been sitting there for about, I suppose, half an hour to an hour, and we heard over the radio, which we had the communications in that OP with the Alpha Control, that somebody had been shot and thrown out the front door. Well, I thought this is going to cause the whole thing to cave in, which it did. And whilst I was looking out the window, I noticed on the roof of the embassy at the back there were some ropes across the roof. Very similar. I'd done quite a lot of rock climbing as a youngster, and I noticed this was a safety rope with points on it for abseiling attachments. 3 or 4 figures come across the roof, just their head and shoulders, between the chimney tops, who were dressed in black, shiny, almost rubber-like material with a machine gun with a torch or a light on the top. And I suddenly realised they must be the SAS, and they were going to clip onto the ropes across the roof and abseil down the back of the embassy.
I first saw them on the roof, and they were there for about a good 20 minutes while they got their ropes together and made sure. And there was also SAS officers on the ground that we could see hiding in the adjoining place.
It's now known that the activities of the SAS on the rooftop hadn't gone entirely unheard by the ringleader, Salim. On the telephone link, the police tried to stall, to stop him investigating further, to keep him talking until everyone was in place.
It all went bolo. There was a voice said, Housebreaker 1, are you ready? And they got the affirmative. They went down the ropes to the balcony, which you can see down there. Unfortunately, one of the chaps going down on his ropes, they fouled somehow. And after they'd thrown the stun grenades in through the window, the flames coming out the window were licking all round his body. Mm-hmm. And he couldn't get out of the way because the ropes hung straight down. And the weight of him kept the rope straight. And he was having to kick off from one side to the other to try and dodge the flames. And I could hear his voice saying, cut the damn ropes, cut the damn ropes. Well, his mates did eventually get to him, cut the ropes, and they all went in through the windows, which they destroyed with the stun grenades and so on, and then they went.
Clinical amid the chaos, the SAS identified who were innocent hostages and who were their captors. Outside, those on the balconies stood by as the bullets flew inside the embassy. One hostage, a BBC man who had been at the embassy to get a visa, scrambled out and away from the gunfire. In dealing with armed terrorists, the SAS took no prisoners. That, at least, was the plan.
You could hear the machine guns going inside, and that was virtually the end of that particular action. Then the hostages started to come out the back of the embassy, along the balcony, around, down through the gap here where the steps are, onto the grass, and they were laid out here where they were cuffed together by SAS and D11. And I thought, well, to finish the thing off, I better photograph the hostages laying on the grass to show how many got out and that they weren't burnt or injured or so on. And as I was clicking the camera, a chappie came across the grass, and he looked up at the window, seeing me taking pictures. He said, "You there, get in, don't take photographs," you know. I thought, well, he's not the chap who's going to tell me whether I do or do not take pictures, so I carried on taking pictures.
There was one hostage that they did bring out, who turned out to be one of the terrorists. And obviously at that time they weren't sure. They had to tie everyone up on the ground regardless. And it was only when they discovered who the terrorist was, I think they wanted to take him back into the embassy and shoot him.
I heard the people talking, but you could hear pretty well everything they said. And one of the chaps who was laying on the grass had 2 SAS men next to him. And one of them said, "This is one of the terrorists who's got out with the hostages." So the other chap said, "Well, let's take the bugger inside and shoot him." And he looked up and saw me at this window, and he said, "We can't take him and do that because he's been photographed. He can't suddenly be alive and now dead." And that was the reason why that chap did survive this episode and went to court and was tried. But it all happened here, as you see it, at the back, and the hostages eventually were led away from here.
The embassy was by now well ablaze, and further damage to it as a crime scene was inevitable from the efforts to put the fire out. The photographic branch had to move quickly to record what was left at the scene. Pictures of exactly how the hostage-takers had defended the premises, where they'd posted their guards, would be analysed for use in future sieges. But the devastation from flame and fire brigade flood was almost total.
The building itself and the adjacent buildings had to be covered in very great detail because the amount of damage was tremendous. Fire damage, flood damage, the fire service had hosed everything down, but I think what was more important, that the actual bodies that were left of Salim Tawfiq, who was the leader, and 1 or 2 of his colleagues, they were still in position, so they all had to be photographed.
As for the terrorists, the rapid-fire machine guns of the SAS had wrought swift and deadly destruction.
There's a lot of debris in there, as well as obviously the terrorists on the floor on the various levels. A lot of ammunition lying around, spent cartridges and magazines. Quite a lot of fire damage, I can remember, because it was a fire, and obviously explosions as well. I mean, the embassy was pretty well gutted, really.
It was covered from top to bottom in very great detail, which ended up with the building being photographed, not only the room where the terrorists were, but every floor, and on the roof, and looking down, and the whole venue. It was covered like a major scene of crime.
Scene of crime photographers see horror in close-up. Yet for their own survival, they have to keep an emotional distance. Most of them soon learn the trick of treating it just like any other job. But there's still room for pride in a job well done.
That shot of the man hanging on the ropes in the flames, I think, is probably one of the best I took.
In Part 4, photographers remember the most violent protest in recent times, the battle in 1990 over the poll tax. And refusing to disperse, the police corral an unpredictable core of May Day protesters. On the early evening streets of London, only a few hundred May Day demonstrators remain. The police have fenced them in at the crossroads of Oxford Circus. There's no time for calculating exposures and careful apertures. Steve Myler has got one shot to get chaos in focus.
You're relying completely on people around you to make sure that you don't actually get injured. Complete tunnel vision. Challenge of producing a good, usable image in a very, very difficult circumstance is part of the appeal. It is a challenge, essentially.
police tactics have contained the protest at some cost to civil liberties. At far-right rallies, there are pictures to be taken on both sides of the barricade. These pictures were taken inside a BNP rally in 1990.
This invasion, if not stemmed, will destroy us for all time.
But there was one which always sticks in my mind, and it was the National Front meeting. And they're a pretty hard mob. And you usually try and photograph troublemakers at a demonstration. In other words, people that our intelligence people would like to keep tabs on that are whipping up the crowd or being particularly vicious and hitting and punching and so on. So it's your duty as a photographer to record these people, and you use your own intelligence who they might be. And we went to this school, which was near Bethnal Green, where they were holding their meeting. And I said to my minder, because you have to have a minder who can guide your elbow and see what's coming, while your eyes glued to the viewfinder, you can't necessarily see what you're doing. And we went to the pavement outside this school, and we were dressed in, ordinary rough clothes. And I had taken the liberty of putting a bit of the National Front literature in my top pocket, so I wouldn't get a good hiding. I could be considered friendly, perhaps, instead of the old Bill. When we got outside the doors, the top chappie of the National Front came, and they cleared the way for him to go in, and we got swept in with him, my minder and the camera. I thought, while we're in here, we better do the business. I stood on a chair up against one wall and filmed the chappie while he was giving his talk, because it was a possibility that he could be talking sedition.
Why do you think that the council is devoting money to the Bangladeshis and the rest of them?
So I filmed all this, and I stood up there for about 40 minutes with this camera on my shoulder, and I'm nearly falling off this chair. And every so often, someone in the audience would stand up and show out that they weren't National Front. And of course, there would be a big punch-up while he was grabbed and thrown out the doors. And I thought, if they ever tumble that we're the old Bill, we're going to get exactly the same treatment. But funny enough, we never got sussed. And at the end of the meeting, we walked out with them, and we had everything on film.
There are more than 20,000 call-outs a year for the 30 members of the photographic squad. Everyone must be ready for anything. It could be a routine road traffic accident, a post-mortem, a murder, another body in the Thames, or something unexpected to challenge the wits of the police photographer.
Oscar Charlie 70 on scene and dealing.
I had a call to go to Big Ben because some protesters had climbed up the outside of Big Ben. It was covered in scaffolding at the time. And they were protesting against nuclear testing. And they'd climbed up during the night and strung a banner across the front of Big Ben. They were then hanging there themselves in little harnesses, but refusing to talk to anybody. They asked me to go up to the top of Big Ben to photograph these protesters, to try to identify them, basically. Fortunately, there was a lift on the outside that the builders had erected, so I travelled to the top of the lift and then climbed the last few feet. The first chap I came to was suspended in a rope hammock, and he was eating his lunch. And I called out to him, and just trying to chat to him. It must be scary out there, or you've got more nerve than I have, and things like that. Just hoping he would look to me and talk to me so I could get a full facial view of him. But he just carried on eating his lunch, and so I had to lean out and photograph him from above. I think nowadays health and safety comes into it a lot more. My most recent instruction is not to work higher than 2 metres from the ground. Obviously, in the past, we've done some crazy things just to get the photograph. It was an amazing view. That was what struck me most. When I'd finished photographing the protesters, I took some more photographs just of the view from the top of Big Ben. I was just amazed by it.
The most violent direct campaign in recent years was 1990's battle over the poll tax. The protesters, without doubt, saw the Met's photographers as a sinister symptom of state surveillance. Certainly, whatever the police photographer may think of the protester, the poll tax protester knew exactly what he thought of him.
To my mind, it was one of the hairiest I think I can remember for personal contact. You're the enemy. Yeah, and of course you start off as a police photographer, but nobody ever tells you when you join that you could be on a sort of front line or against people who just don't want you there, and they'll make it quite plain physically that they don't want you there. Being deliberately obstructed, or somebody want to smash the camera, or they wanted to do you physical injury and things like this. So you really had to keep your wits about you, and this is where your sound man, who was your number 2, was your extra set of eyes, and it was just judicious sometimes to just quietly leave and go away. But we had strict instructions that if you were asked who you were, you had to say who you were, and it was far better in our view to retreat from the scene, go away, and come back again. So you never denied that you were police. But obviously, it didn't pay you because you obviously wouldn't get the sort of filming you want.
There are genuine worries that we live under a state of surveillance. But the police, too, are sometimes in the photographer's frame.
I don't really mind what occurs in front of the camera. It's my job to record it. And if there was a situation where a policeman belted somebody, and if it was in front of the camera, it would get recorded. I wouldn't deliberately swing the camera away because the action of moving the camera away would indicate that I'm biased towards wrongly reporting that which happened in front of the camera.
As this year's May Day ends, the crowd grows restive. On each side of the thin blue line, protest sets the pulses racing.
I suppose at the end of the day, it's the adrenaline buzz. I'm sure the demonstrators on the other side of the fence, if you like, get exactly the same thing, which I think is what today is about. Probably arouses some terrible primal instinct in us all, I don't know.
At Oxford Circus, a final surge of protest, but the demonstrators will soon begin to disperse. Only the photographic record remains on file. Something perhaps to protest about another day.